I'm here to present a documentary film called In the Footsteps of George Chinnery, an English artist in Macau. And it's about a particularly interesting and talented British artist who spent almost all his career in the East and 27 years in Macau, painting and drawing and making his living over here. Well, I think it's an important story for Macau, firstly because he documented Chinese life, lively drawings of what people actually did in those days. Blacksmiths, the porters, the vendors, the fishermen, the boat people. Quite a lot of these paintings and drawings still survive. So they give us a wonderful idea of what life was like on the South China coast at that time. And there's a lot of interest in Chinnery's paintings, not just here, but elsewhere in the world. He was a very active artist. He used to get up in the morning and he couldn't allow himself to have breakfast until he'd taken a number of sketches of new subjects which you might find on the beaches or the streets of Macau. Artists in Chinnery's time really had to make their living by painting portraits. That's really where the money was. And he was a flamboyant, romantic portrait artist, I think you'd say, with dramatic contrasts of light and shade. And he painted the great and the good, both in India and in China when he arrived here. He painted the Chinese merchants, the Parsis, the Westerners, and their wives and families in many cases. I think drawing was what he really loved to do. And he'd go out and he'd paint little figures, and he'd take a great deal of trouble to get them absolutely right. He became quite obsessive in his drawing. And he'd paint the figures in the marketplace, the vendors, the herdsmen with their cattle, and out in the fields and on the seashore. And he'd try to get new subjects and new groups, and I think it became something that really occupied a great deal of his time, and he actually became better and better at it. Well, I'm an art historian by training, and I worked in an extraordinary building called the Royal Pavilion in Brighton in England, which was built by King George IV in an Oriental style. And he brought in quite a lot of Chinese objects, Chinese furnishing, wallpaper and so on. And I organized an exhibition back in the 1980s on this subject, and Chinnery featured quite large in that exhibition. We were able to borrow some wonderful Chinnery works from Hong Kong and Macau at that time. And ever since then, I've been particularly interested in George Chinnery and written quite a bit about him, but also about the other artists who came out to the China coast, and indeed the Chinese artists who worked for the Westerners in a particular style, sometimes called Chinese export painting. I think there's growing interest, certainly, in Chinese export painting. I think there are new museums being built recently in Macau, also in Guangzhou, and they have collections of these paintings. They do show, in a way that other paintings don't, precisely how places like Guangzhou and Macau and Whampoa and the Pearl River looked in those days. The Chinese artists tried to be as accurate as possible, to get all the details of the architecture and the landscape and the rigging and the figures as accurate as possible, so that they could be taken back to the West as large-scale souvenirs, if you like. We're shooting for 8 days, and we're going to be in the central historic part of Macau, at the Ama Temple, one of Chinnery's favorite places, at San Domingos and San Lorenzo churches, be some of the back streets. He did a lot of drawings on the old Praia Grande, which has now partly disappeared, but there's still a wonderful bit of rocky foreshore over in Coloane. There's always been interest in Macau as a very early Western settlement in China since the mid-16th century, the start of Portuguese trade with China and the Jesuit missions and so on. But I think in recent years, the 19th century has become an object of historians' focus. The role of the Opium Wars has been reassessed. It's something that we haven't perhaps taken as seriously as we should have done in the West. And of course, Chinnery has played a part in this reassessment, because through exhibitions that have been held in England, America, Tokyo even, artists, principally Chinnery, but also Chinese artists, have allowed us to see what it was actually like living in this part of the world at that time.